Those who have been following my content for quite some time now will know that I have an Instagram series called The Limbs of Yoga. That series has been leading up to this video. In this video, I will outline the limbs of yoga as well as give an outline of the philosophical backdrop in which to understand these limbs. This video will be heavily practice-centered, and although I will be discussing some of the key philosophical details of the yoga school of Patanjali, my main focus will be on how can we implement them, how can we practice yoga. With that being said, what is yoga? Now, there are debates as to the origins of the school of yoga that we know today. We know that at some point an author named Patanjali authored the Yoga Sutras, but it is a matter of debate as to whether or not he was merely compiling the works of previous authors under one text, or whether this was a novel development on his part. The history and developments of yoga will be inconsequential to this video, as we'll be focusing on the philosophical and practical aspects of the yogic tradition as it's understood in the classical period. We will touch on some of the developments in Hatha Yoga and these kind of things, but our focus will be on the classical school of Patanjali and his followers. So to begin, we'll discuss the philosophy of yoga. The yogic school of thought is deeply intertwined with another school of thought known as Sankhya. In fact, its entire metaphysical foundations are contingent upon Sankhyan philosophy. So what is Sankhya? Sankhyan philosophy is rooted in a fundamental dualism between Purusha, or witness consciousness, and Prakriti, the primordial ground of nature. Purusha is the seer, pure witness consciousness, which is simply aware. Prakriti is the thing it becomes aware of. It is the primordial ground of existence. Somewhere, the Purusha becomes entangled with Prakriti. That is, the seer, the witness, becomes intertwined with the material primordial ground, and from there arise the various elements, starting with buddhi, which is the intellect, and then ahankara, the ego, manas, the mind, and then from there the sensory organs develop, such as touch, taste, sight, sound, smell. And then from there, the gross elements of air, water, fire, earth, and space. Arising from this entanglement between Purusha and Prakriti, we see the emergence of sensory experience for the witness. The witness now becomes the witness of sensory experience because it has become entangled with Prakriti. It's important to understand that yoga and Sankhya are pluralist. That is to say, there's not just one Purusha, as is the case in the Advaitin school. Rather, there's a multitude of Purushas. Each of us is an individual, ontologically distinct Purusha entangled with Prakriti, entangled with material nature. And so liberation then consists in Kaivalya, isolation, where Purusha successfully detangled itself from Prakriti and abides in its own nature, in complete isolation. Now, if we're discussing Sankhya, it's important to discuss the Gunas. Gunas refer to the qualities or modes of material nature. Sankhya holds that there are three: sattva, rajas, and tamas. Sattva represents the mode of purity. That is to say, it is light, it is bright, and it is absolutely pure contentment. Rajas represents a state of activity, motion, mobility, dynamism, constant movement. And tamas represents a state of inertia, darkness, dwelling in ignorance. So sattva is often associated with illumination, tamas is often associated with darkness and ignorance, and rajas is associated with activity and movement and, to some extent, entanglement with the material world. Although all of these arise out of the Purusha's entanglement with Prakriti. This is why you'll see people saying you should live a sattvic life. Sattva merely is that which guides us to purity or knowledge, and as such, most people will say, as you purify yourself, you live more in accordance with sattva, and eventually you surpass the three gunas. Because Purusha exists outside of these three modes of material nature. These modes of material nature belong to Prakriti. Now, if the goal is complete detanglement, complete isolation from Prakriti, then Purusha must dwell in itself, and Purusha is beyond the three modes of material nature. From here, we get to the concepts of Avidya, Vidya, and Viveka. Avidya represents ignorance. It is the mode that Purusha exists in when it holds itself to be eternally entangled with Prakriti, in that the Purusha sees itself as part and parcel of Prakriti. It identifies with the ego, with the intellect, with the mind, with the senses, with the body. Whereas knowledge, also Viveka, discernment, is the recognition of the truth that Purusha is eternally detangled from Prakriti. There is no actual entanglement. To understand this, we have to understand Sankhya's notion of Satkaryavada. This is their theory of causality, which states that the effect is pre-existent in the cause. Now, what does this mean? Say I have a piece of clay, and I fashion it into a pot. Nothing new is created in the creation of the pot. It's merely the rearrangement of the material of the clay into the shape of a pot, right? Nothing new is produced in that act. It is simply a rearrangement. Similarly, material reality is nothing more than the rearrangement or transformation of the original primordial ground of existence, that is Prakriti. So Sankhyan causality is called Satkaryavada, but it can also be called Prakriti Parinamavada. That is to say, unlike Advaita, which holds that this transformation is illusory and that there is no actual transformation, Sankhya holds that there is a real transformation that occurs within Prakriti. That is to say that the primordial ground of nature comes into being through the three material modes and through its entanglement with Purusha. And upon realization, upon Kaivalya, the knowledge that Purusha is eternally detangled from Prakriti, it dissolves back into the primordial ground of nature. So you see this evolution and dissolution into that primordial ground, dependent upon its entanglement with the witness consciousness. Though, it's very important to stress that this is a real transformation that occurs of material nature. It's not simply illusory. The Purusha remains unchanged, inasmuch as it is still the witness. However, its entanglement with Prakriti fundamentally transforms Prakriti, whereas the Purusha remains untransformed. There's only the appearance of transformation because one identifies with the ego. Now, given this philosophical backdrop, we can now begin discussing the 8 limbs of yoga. First, we'll start with Yama. Yamas are ethical do-nots. That is to say, one ought not do these things if they're pursuing liberation. Remember, liberation is Kaivalya, detanglement from material nature or Prakriti. So these will be actions that, if you don't do these things, you are pursuing detachment from material nature. So the first is ahimsa, which is non-violence. This refers to non-violence in thoughts as well as actions and intention, right? In ahimsa, it's important to note that merely refraining from action is not enough. Having a disposition that is attuned away from violence, that is to say, you may be a soldier, right? And it may be your duty to fight. But if you are non-cruel, if you perform your duty merely by virtue of it being your duty, as opposed to being possessed with a spirit of violence that's simply wanting to enact violence, then you're doing the right thing. However, if you are possessed with that spirit of violence, that strong desire for violence, then you have strayed from the yama of ahimsa. The next yama is satya, truthfulness. Now, in honesty, this is not a do not. It is more of a do. That is to say, one should be truthful. Truth is the foundation of existence. It is the basis upon which all things are able to exist. We are able to trust our experiences by virtue of them being truthful. We are able to trust others by basis of them being truthful to us. Being truthful, abiding within truth, is essential for the pursuit of Kaivalya, because truth represents the refraining from falsehood. And the ultimate falsehood is that of ignorance, that the Purusha is entangled with Prakriti. If we can remain truthful in all our endeavors, we can come to that ultimate truth as well, that Purusha is never entangled with Prakriti, and that it is true witness consciousness existing in isolation. The next is asteya, which is non-stealing. This is a relatively straightforward yama. That is to say, one should not covet, One should not desire that which does not belong to them. There's a verse in the Ishopanishad, the first verse, which says, all of this is covered by the Lord, therefore do not covet what is not yours, because ultimately wealth does not belong to you. Now this is a very Advaitin framing or very Vedantin framing. However, even within the Sankhya Yoga philosophy, your material wealth is not truly yours, right? If you are the Purusha, if you are the witness consciousness, then nothing that arises out of the modes of material nature is yours or belongs to you. In fact, those things are inconsequential to you because you can abide in your very seerness and be completely isolated and self-satisfied without the desire for what you do not possess. This leads us very naturally into our next yama, brahmacharya. Brahmacharya has been a bit bastardized in both the West and the East. Brahmacharya refers not just to sexual restraint or sexual abstinence, right? Though it is understood as such in the West and in the East. Brahmacharya refers again more so to a disposition, an attitude of restraint from sensual pleasure. That includes the enjoyment of marvelous foods, the experience of beautiful works of art. These experiences of beauty are non-distinct from the experience of pleasure we gain in sexual satisfaction. As such, given that our disposition towards being worldly arises from the same root, the yogic school says one should not desire that which is outside. One should have control over one's senses. Let me give you an example. Say I'm possessed with a strong urge to eat ice cream. I can chase after the ice cream. I can go to the store. I can buy it. No problem. Right? The yogic school says it matters not whether you eat the ice cream or not, but whether you possess the restraint to refrain from pursuing it. Right? Say I'm on a fast, on a diet, and I tell myself I shouldn't eat the ice cream no matter what. And yet I give in to my craving over and over again. That is a violation of brahmacharya. Not that I ate the ice cream, but that I don't have the mental strength, the mental to resolve to resist that consumption. It is the disposition of restraint, the control over one's sensory faculties that is referred to by brahmacharya. The last yama to discuss is aparigraha, or non-possessiveness. Much like asteya refers to not coveting that which belongs to someone else, aparigraha refers to the fact that we should not even cling on to what belongs to us. Because that which at one moment is ours, the very next minute could belong to someone else. I may be a king surrounded by wealth, but the next moment, if an invading army comes and destroys my land and takes over, I'm left with nothing. That isn't to say one should run off into the forest and not own anything. Again, it's more of an attitude, more of a disposition of detachment. That if I were to lose everything I have today, I would be satisfied, I would be content, because my satisfaction and my contentment are not dependent upon my clinging to objects that belong to me or my aversion of those things being taken from me. My satisfaction comes from within. This is what's referred to as aparigraha. Now that we've covered the 5 yamas, we can move on to the 5 niyamas. We can begin with shaucha, which is purity. Purity can have many meanings. We can refer to purity of body. The yogic school places great emphasis on physical purification, not just through ritual, but also regular bathing, regular cleansing. These things are very important, and we see these elaborated on in Hatha Yoga, which we'll discuss later as we discuss Asana and Pranayama. It's important, however, in the yogic school of thought to be of a pure body. That means to say, one's diet should be controlled and pure. One's behaviors and patterns should be towards the pursuit of cleanliness. That also refers to the state of the mind. One's mind should not be constantly cluttered with worries and concerns and anxieties. One's mind should be able to rest in its own purity and contentment. And this is easier said than done, of course. Purity of body is more easily achieved than purity of mind. But the yogic school understands that from purity of body also arises purity of mind. That once you've purified the body, you create a ground in which a pure mind can stabilize itself. It is impossible to have a pure mind and an impure body. Because if your body is impure, your thoughts will be polluted with the corruption of your body, the impurity of your body. So it's important to maintain absolute purity of both body and mind in the yogic school of thought. That is shaucha. Santosha is the next niyama, and this relates to the yamas that we've discussed earlier. It is contentment. Again, no matter what state I exist in, whether I'm a beggar, an ascetic, or a wealthy king flourishing with wealth, I remain content in my own being. That the clinging and grasping at external sensory objects or averting oneself away from pain is a false pursuit, because you will suffer, you will experience pain, and you will experience pleasure as well. Having a content state of mind throughout both states, neither becoming overly excited at sensory pleasure, nor becoming overly despondent and depressed upon sensory pain, that is contentment, that is santosha. Tapas, the next niyama, has also been bastardized, let's say, in the West and East. Tapas does not refer to rigid physical austerity, that I'll go into the mountains and raise my hand up for 30 years. That can be a form of tapas, but tapas simply refers to any austerity. That can be fasting, that can be a vow of silence, that can be any sort of willing sacrifice you make that makes your life marginally more uncomfortable, but aids in the pursuit of contentment. Tapas is meant to be the fire through which you are purified. That is to say, that when you engage in these austerities, self-sacrifices, then you become content even in the state in which you are lacking. This is a very Stoic thought. Say I only shower with cold water for a month. Now, whether my shower is hot or cold, it doesn't matter to me. I'm content. I'm neither chasing sensory pleasure nor running away from sensory pain. I've become content in both a state of pleasure and pain by virtue of pursuing an austerity. If I fast, I am becoming satisfied with not eating for many days. Now, if I were to unwillingly be forced to in a situation where I can't eat for several days, I would be content because I've already put myself through the austerity of fasting. The next niyama is svadhyaya, self-study. Svadhyaya is not just the study of scriptures or the study of philosophy, though these are aspects of svadhyaya. More importantly, it is study of the self, reflection upon one's thoughts, one's emotions, one's mental patternings, and one's likes and dislikes, attachments and aversions. Simple observation of these. Because it's understood that if you recognize yourself, you're better able to avoid the traps that you can fall into. For example, if I know that I have a certain vice, a certain attachment, I would not surround myself with that vice. I would slowly begin to cultivate detachment from that vice, such that eventually I'm content without it. Svadhyaya helps you hone your non-possessiveness and your contentment in a way that nothing else really can. You must be aware of what your attachments are before you begin to sever them at the root. And so that is svadhyaya, study of the self, study of one's mind, study of one's body, recognition of one's flaws, and from that recognition, we see what we can improve. Lastly, in the niyamas, we have Ishvara Pranidhana, contemplation on the Lord. Ishvara is a very interesting notion in the yogic school of thought. In contemporary Hinduism, it's understood that Ishvara is the cosmic creator of the world, often identified with Krishna or Vishnu or Shiva, the all-pervasive creator, destroyer, preserver. Ishvara is not as such in the yogic school of thought. In fact, Patanjali refers to Ishvara as simply a Vishesha Purusha, who is unaffected by the kleshas. What does this mean? Vishesha means a unique or special Purusha. So in a way, Ishvara is the same kind of being we are. We are Purusha. Ishvara is also Purusha. However, Ishvara in Patanjali's view is not afflicted by attachments and aversions or by sensory pleasures or anything like that. Ishvara is already content and serves as a spiritual guide or a catalyst for transformation. Contemplation or reflection on Ishvara can help us understand how we can eventually reach that state as well. Ishvara is simply a special type of Purusha that, being unaffected, can help us understand how we can become unaffected by the kleshas and disassociate ourselves from Prakriti. So far we've discussed 2 of the 8 limbs of yoga. Now we'll move on to asana. Asana, when you hear the word yoga, people immediately turn to the yoga asanas. Things like downward dog, or the lotus position, which is known as Padmasana, or various other asanas, physical postures. This is what people identify with yoga, no doubt due to the modern influence of Hatha Yoga on the West. In the Yoga Sutras, no postures are described. Asana is simply described as the seat of meditation, a posture you can maintain for long periods of time while engaging in meditative practice. And in the commentary on the Yoga Sutras, which we now consider to be written by Patanjali himself, there are only 12 asanas listed. They're all seated asanas. They are merely ways one can sit for a long period of time and contemplate and meditate, rather than being any form of stretching and that kind of thing. The 84 or 108 asanas, however you want to categorize them, as we know them today, arise from Hatha Yoga. Hatha Yoga is a medieval development in the yogic school inspired by the tantras. We'll make a separate whole video on Hatha Yoga, as well as outlining the various asanas in Hatha Yoga and the structure in which these yogic postures exist in Hatha Yoga and the purpose of them. For the sake of this video, all it's important to note is that asana is a simple way, seated posture one can meditate in. You can even sit on a chair, and that can be an asana. Sitting on the floor cross-legged, that is an asana. For the sake of this video and for the sake of Patanjali, we will define asana simply as that. One of the 12, or if you want to be a bit more broad, one of the many ways one can sit and meditate for a long period of time comfortably. The next concept, which has received a lot of development in Hatha Yoga, though its origins date back to Patanjali itself, is Pranayama. Pranayama, according to Patanjali, is simply the control over one's breath, where one closes their eyes and observes the breath going in and coming out, and it particularly refers to the point where one has breathed out but has not yet taken a breath in. That moment in between the exhale and the inhale, focusing and meditating and contemplating on that point, that is pranayama. There are descriptions of yogis who have gone ages in that state, in between an in-breath and an out-breath. And so for yoga, for the sake of classical yoga, it's understood that pranayama is simply the control over the breath. This is, of course, elaborated in Hatha Yoga, where it's thought that the control of the breath is the means by which one can control the flow of the subtle energy in the body, the prana in the body. And through subtle channels of energy, one can control the mind, the processes of the mind and the processes of the body through the breath. However, this is elaborated a bit later on, and we'll discuss that in our Hatha Yoga video. The next topic to discuss, going immediately from pranayama, is Pratyahara. Pratyahara refers to the withdrawal of the senses. It's not simply closing one's eyes. Rather, it is the point at which one sits, brings the senses inwards, rather than hearing the sounds going on in the outside world, or seeing the sights available in the outside world, or smelling the scents available in the outside world. One brings the senses inwards and contemplates on those senses and seeks to withdraw them, much like a turtle withdraws into its shell, rather than grasping out at the world, withdrawing the senses inwards. That is the first step of the next 4 angas of yoga, the next 4 limbs of yoga, which detail meditative practice. So first we have withdrawal of the senses, that is pratyahara. Next we have dharana, which is turning one's attention, single-minded focus on an object or a mental concept. I can imagine a light burning in between my eyes, close my eyes and reflect on that light and simply observe it. Or I can conjure up the image of a sun burning in between my eyes or at any point and simply observe that image. That is dharana, one-minded, concentrated focus on an object of internal perception. It can even be external. One can be gazing at a lamp or gazing at a particular point on the wall. That can be dharana as well. After dharana, we have dhyana, which is now reflection on the object of contemplation. Whereas earlier I was looking at the sun in my mind's eye, Now I am observing it. I am reflecting on its aspects in more detail. I'm looking at the brilliance of the color of the sun. I'm looking at the solar flares coming out of the image of the sun in my mind. I'm looking at the maybe the orbit or the rotation or the brilliance of light coming out of the sun. That is dhyana. Now I'm reflecting, contemplating on the object of my meditation that we established in dharana. So we see how we've withdrawn the senses, we've observed an internal object in the mind, and now we're reflecting on it. That is Pratyahara, Dharana, and Dhyana. From there we come to Samadhi. Samadhi is of two types. The first type is a bit more elaborate and a bit more laid out and leads very naturally into the second type. So we'll begin there. The first type is Savikalpa or Sampragyata. This type of Samadhi is Savikalpa, with thought, with mental construction. So for example, I am contemplating on the sun. I've created a mental image of the sun in my head. That is a vikalpa. That is a mental construct. So within Savikalpa Samadhi, there is Savitarka Samadhi. This is contemplation with reason. So perhaps I'm internally having a monologue with myself about the nature of the sun. Wow, look at its brilliance, look at the light of the sun, look at these wondrous colors arising from the sun. It's tainted, the samadhi is tainted with mental thoughts and the flow of thoughts about that object of concentration. Next we have savichara. Savichara samadhi is another type of savikalpa samadhi in which there is no flow of constant thoughts. Rather, there's a more subtle perception. So maybe I'm not contemplating on a sun, right, a mental construct of the sun. Rather, maybe I'm contemplating on my own ego, right, a more subtle form of contemplation. I'm contemplating my I amness, my beingness, my individuality, or contemplating on my intellect or my buddhi. And simply observing, not allowing the arising of thoughts and the flow of concentration, simply one-minded observation on the ego or the intellect or one of the more subtler tattvas, as opposed to a mental construct derivative of the base sensory perception. In doing so, two things arise. First is sasmita samadhi. This is exactly as I was saying, contemplating on I amness or beingness. I'm simply reflecting on, I've gone through the whole process of Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, and my object of contemplation this whole time is my own beingness, my own awareness. That is still tainted by Prakriti. And the reason it's still tainted by Prakriti is, in doing so, you're contemplating your ahankara, your ego. And we've already discussed how buddhi, ahankara, and the various other tattvas arise from the Purusha's entanglement with Prakriti. And yet, in doing so, we find another type of samadhi, sananda samadhi, samadhi with bliss. There is the experience of bliss that arises in savikalpa samadhi, that one-minded concentration. And in this, we have the observer, which is the Purusha, observing something else out there, right? Maybe it's within the mind, but it's still something out there. There's an observer and a thing observed. The goal in savikalpa samadhi is the union, the samapti of the object of concentration and the subject of concentration, such that there is no gap between the two. There is no subject-object distinction. And arising from that, you'll see first contemplation on I amness, which is sasmita samadhi, and then sananda samadhi, contemplation which is still tainted by prakriti, inasmuch as it contains within it ananda or bliss. Even bliss is something that arises from the sattva guna, which is something that is tainted by prakriti. That ecstasy, that spiritual bliss, that is still a roadblock in the cultivation of true viveka, of true knowledge of the self, because it is tainted by prakriti. Lastly, once we've gone through this whole process of withdrawing the senses, creating an object of concentration, reflecting on that object of concentration, merging our subject with the object of concentration such that there's no distinction between the two. The perfect form of that is nirvikalpa or asampragyata samadhi, in which there is no subject-object distinction. There's only subjecthood. There is no tainting of prakriti there. There is no bliss. There is no I amness. There is no ahankara. There is no intellect, no buddhi, no manas, no mind, no gross elements, no sensory experience. All of the tattvas have now dissolved into the very subject of experience, that is the Purusha. Now that nirvikalpa samadhi is the state in which, again, as we discussed earlier, all of these things have dissolved back into the primordial ground of creation, that is Prakriti, and one dwells in their own nature as the Purusha, as the seer, without any object of perception. There's only the seer, there's nothing else. That is the state of Kaivalya. That is the state of ultimate isolation and detachment from the material world. And we can see now that each of the angas acts not as an independent practice. It's not that you can just do asana and be fine, or you can just do Yama and Niyama and be fine, or that you can just do Samadhi and isolation and be fine. Each of these are all essential to yogic practice. One must live according to the yamas and niyamas. One must practice asana. And then in a seated state where you contemplate, then you control the breath, you withdraw the senses, you contemplate on an object, you dissolve your subjectivity into the object until all that's left is subjectivity. All of these work together in the yogic school of thought. You cannot have one without the other, nor is it a progression. Maybe from asana onwards, it's kind of a progression in as much as you seat yourself in a place where you can meditate comfortably, and then you do Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, and Samadhi. However, through that, every day as you do that, you must still be practicing the ethical principles of Yama and Niyama. In fact, it'll be easier to practice these the more you engage in this meditative practice. In conclusion, we've outlined the various angas, the various limbs of yoga, and tied them all back together to the overall Sankhya Yoga system, in which Purusha and Prakriti are eternally bound together. And it is the goal of yoga to detangle Purusha from Prakriti so it can exist in complete isolation, in complete Kaivalya, in its own I amness, in its own subjectivity, without any tainting of the object, without any arising of bondage with Prakriti. And Prakriti dissolves back into its primordial, unmanifest nature. Thank you for watching. If you've watched this far, thank you. Leave a like, comment, subscribe. If you could follow my Instagram or TikTok, that is at the Mahayogi, that would be really fantastic. I love all of my subscribers. This is a project that's been in the work for several months now, and I'm finally happy to get it out of the way. I'll be uploading shorts of this on Instagram and TikTok. If you don't have time to watch the full video, make sure to at least check those out. Thank you so much. Hope you guys have a wonderful day.